Now, in these next few videos, we're going to dive into very specific pricing structures that ISOs use when they're selling merchants. But I want you to really forget about merchant services for just a minute at the beginning of this video. We're going to be talking about tier pricing, but I want to really set the stage by getting you to forget about merchant services and use a simpler example that will help you to really understand how this works. So I want you to imagine for a second that you own a hat store. Okay. Some of you may have seen in a local mall, you might have seen a store like Lids where they sell just ball caps. That's all they sell is hats. Okay. I want you to imagine for a second that you own a store just like that. Okay. Now I want you to think for a second, first of all, about your cost structure, right? You have to buy these hats from somewhere, probably different vendors, and odds are you're going to have to pay more for certain hats that might be in higher demand than other hats. And so you have variable cost, right? Every hat doesn't cost you the same. You have to pay all kinds of different costs for these hats. And so as you get these hats in, you're going to put them up on the shelf. You had to pay money to get the hats. Of course, you have overhead costs as well, your light bill, your employees, all that kind of stuff. But, at the end of the day, you've got these variable costs for these hats plus your overhead, and now you need to make a profit. So how are you going to price your hats in order to make a profit, right? Well, the first way that you could do it, and the way that would be maybe really popular, is you say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take all my hats and I'm going to put them all onto one of 3 shelves. So I'm going to have my discount shelf where all the hats are only $10. I'm going to have my, in-demand hats or whatever that are maybe $20. And then I'm going to have my high-profile hats that are $30. Maybe that's, last year's Super Bowl champ or whatever. And so you've got these really high, hats in really high demand, high-profile hats, and they're $30. So what you've done is you've created these 3 different shelves, and based on how much it costs you to buy a particular hat, you can put that hat on the appropriate shelf. So the customer walking in, they don't know exactly how much it costs you to buy that hat. But what they do is they're looking and kind of going, okay, these are the inexpensive hats. These are kind of the medium expensive hats. These are the really expensive hats. And so they're able to look at that and very simply grasp your pricing structure. So the beauty of that pricing structure is that it's very simple because, the consumer can come in and find the hat that they want to buy, right? Also, it's nice for you because there are some hats that you probably got at a discount. This pricing structure enables you to sell those hats at a lower cost, while your higher demand hats you can sell progressively higher costs with these kind of 3 tiers or 3 different levels of pricing. Okay. Now, let's relate this back to merchant services. So one of the most popular pricing structures today is tiered pricing. How does tiered pricing work? Well, what happens is that the processing company, and I'm going to use the words ISO and processor interchangeably here, but the ISO or the processing company, what they do is they go to the merchant and they say, look, when you process transactions, we are getting these costs. We have interchange fees we have to pay. We have the costs from the card brand associations, and we have our overhead. We have to pay for support, tech support, underwriting, our building rent, all of this overhead as well, just like in the example of the hat store. And so what will happen is the processing company will say to the merchant, I tell you what we'll do. We are going to give you 3 different rates or tiers. And if we have a transaction that's a low-cost transaction where the issuing bank didn't charge us a very high interchange rate, we're going to give you that one at the lowest rate. And in our industry, we call that lowest rate the qualified rate. The qualified rate, okay? So they're saying these transactions are qualified for that lowest rate. And maybe they give that to them at 1.5%. And they say these transactions are the lowest cost. They're going to be qualified, okay? Then they say the transactions that are maybe not lowest cost, they're kind of that middle level, we're going to put those at mid-qualified. So mid-qualified rate, a little bit higher rate than the qualified. So those transactions are going to be mid-qualified, right? Then we have the third category, which is the highest transaction. So the transactions that have the highest cost to the processor, they pass those on to the merchant at the highest rate, which is called the non-qualified. So these did not qualify for the good rate. So it's qualify for the best rate. Mid-qualified means they didn't quite qualify for the lowest rate, but they're also not in the highest bucket. And then you have non-qualified, which means they're at the highest rate. So maybe it's 1.5% qualified, 1.9% mid-qualified, 3.5% non-qualified. And so you have those different rates there. Now, Again, going back to the hat example, it's exactly the same thing. The upside is that it is a little bit simpler. And so for the merchant, when they look at their statement, they actually can understand it, pretty easily when they look at it and see these transactions are all at one rate, these are all at one, and these are all at one. So there's only 3 different rates there. The downside, just like with the hat example, is there's really no transparency. The merchant actually doesn't know if the processor is marking them up a lot or a little. They don't see the underlying costs. All they understand is that, well, this is what it is, right? And so there's simplicity. It's easy to understand, but there's not as much transparency. You don't really know for sure how much money the processor is making, but that's tiered pricing. Now, the other thing we want to talk about here with tiered pricing is, in our industry, what exactly is it that makes a transaction cost more, right? We touched on this in other modules of like interchange fees and what that is. So if you have questions about that, definitely go back and watch the introduction to credit card processing to understand what interchange fees are and who charges them. But why are the interchange fees up and down? I mentioned in that video that the average interchange cost is 1.7%, and that is the average in the US market today. But there are interchange transactions where it's less than 0.5%. There are others that are higher than 3%. So why is that, right? Like what's happening? Why are they varying so much? So let's break down qualified, mid-qualified, and non-qualified, and I'll explain, generally speaking, what puts them into each category. Now, before I do that, little disclaimer here. In our industry, this is not standardized. So there are some processors that would call a transaction non-qualified, where a different processor might say, no, we would say that's mid-qualified. Or some might say this is qualified, another might say, no, it's mid-qualified. So this is not a ironclad standardized thing, but I'm going to give you kind of a general idea so that when you do look at a statement and you see terms like qualified or qual, or mid-qual, mid-qualified, or non-qual, non-qualified, when you see those terms and you recognize this is tier pricing, why are they in these different buckets so that it'll help you to understand and explain it to the merchant. So number one, we talk about qualified. A transaction is generally qualified if it is a standard card type that is swiped through the terminal. Standard card type swiped through the terminal. So it's not a rewards card, it's not a corporate card, it's just a regular credit card or debit card, and I'm just swiping it through the terminal. All right, that's qualified transactions as a general rule. Mid-qualified normally has to do with the method of entry. Also could have to do with the type of card if it's maybe a lower end rewards card. So some of the lower reward cards end up going to mid-qualified, but also the method of entry. So you may have a regular credit card that would normally be qualified, but because the person is calling in the order over the phone, or because they're using a gateway and they're doing like a shopping cart, an online transaction, the risk of those transactions having a chargeback is higher. So for instance, if I went into a store and I bought a $100 worth of clothing in a store, I went up to the counter, I inserted my chip card, and then I signed for the transaction, it's pretty unlikely that I'm going to call my bank the next day and say that wasn't me, right? That's pretty unlikely because I know I'm not going to get away with that. The business owner is going to say, it was you. You inserted your card, and I have a signed slip of paper. You were here at the store, and you bought the stuff, right? Maybe they even have me on camera. Like, that's not I'm not going to have a lot of risk there of chargeback. But if I'm trying to rip off a merchant and I go online and I buy $100 of clothing online, it's definitely possible that I could come back and say, that wasn't me. Well, the merchant says, well, who was it? Well, I don't know, but it wasn't me. It all of a sudden becomes a lot more difficult for the merchant to prove that it was really you. Same thing with a phone order, right? So you'll see this with maybe a pizza shop where they have qualified transactions where people come into the store and buy pizza. Then you'll see some mid-qualified where people are calling in over the phone to make an order for delivery. That method of entry kicked it up to mid-qualified, okay? And again, some of the lower-end rewards cards are also going to be that way. Now, when we get to non-qualified transactions, that is almost always having to do with the card type. These are going to be your higher-end rewards cards, cashback cards, corporate cards, things like that where the interchange rate is a lot higher, not because of the risk of chargeback, but because of the rewards that are being given to the consumer. And so, you see these all the time, right? You see these things, you get 1% cash back, get 2% cash back. Who pays that 1% or 2%? The merchant pays that through the interchange fees. So the interchange fees on those cards are a lot higher. Businesses also, there's more of a risk with business to business transactions. So businesses have these corporate cards, higher risk. There's no personal credit to run. There's no personal assets to hold against things like that. And so those transactions have a higher interchange cost. So the type of card goes into the non-qualified. So this will help you because when you look at a statement and you see these terms about, tier pricing, this is really going to help you to understand what exactly this is and why they're priced the way that they are priced. So that's tier pricing. Let's jump into the next one here in the next video.